Well, pretty much. I mean, it is funny because the pandemic, it was a terrible time for everybody, and everybody had a pretty
Sure.
awful time. But at the time, I was working as a night manager in a hotel, and because the hotels all closed, we were all put onto furlough. And I thought to myself, well, this is giving me an opportunity. This is giving me the time to actually use the furlough almost as if I'm getting paid at the end of each week for writing. So I essentially just started using the writing as my full-time position. I would get up 8 o'clock in the morning, I would start, I'd finish about 5 o'clock in the afternoon. I'd do that Monday to Friday. And before I knew it, I had a larger body of work than I would have had if I was doing the day job. So, or the night job as it was. So I did sort of capitalize on it in that respect. And any writer knows that it is really all about time. How much time you get to write anything will sort of dictate whether or not that work turns out to be any good. And as it turned out, having all that time really worked out for me because producers in particular could not start shooting anything. All the shoots had stopped, so producers had nothing to do but read material, and I was just churning out material every week, essentially. So it worked out for me, which is not to downgrade the sacrifices or the suffering of people during the
Of
pandemic.
course.
But I found that it was very motivating for me, and also probably very good for mental health and things like that, to be able to be creative and have an outlet during that time, because a lot of people didn't. So I felt quite lucky in that respect. I think that's absolutely true. I think you have to. The only way to be a writer really is to write, and I think, and also reading, I think, is important. Having enough time to read. The more you read, the more you understand how you construct certain things and how story structure works and plot structure. With screenwriting, it's a very different discipline because with screenwriting, you are looking at it, the storytelling is very different to prose or anything like that, and it is as much about structure as it is about character or as it is about dialogue. But time is everything, and the more time you spend writing, the better you get. And I have a lot of people that come up to me and they say, "Were you not annoyed that it took 20 years from finishing film school to now to sort of get the career started where now I am working in the industry. Now I have got commissions. Now I am getting offered bits and bobs here and there. And I often say to them that no, those 20 years gave me an extra 2 decades of learning my craft. And the writing is better now than it was back when I was 21 years old and graduating. I don't have as much energy now as I did back then. So I suppose I would have liked to have had a 20 something's energy now in order to
Sure.
work longer. But the time is everything in terms of that. So the more you write, the more time you have to write, the better you get. It's just as simple as that.
Still
Saying, isn't it? It's
there.
how do you get to Carnegie Hall? Practice. It's the same thing. It's
Sure.
you have to, someone like Aaron Sorkin doesn't get to that level without 30 odd years of struggle and strife and stuff like that. I mean, not to compare myself to Aaron Sorkin. For a start, our paychecks are vastly different. But whenever you see him talk in his master classes or Q&As, you get a sense of how hard that man actually works. I mean, he works insanely hard. You think of the TV series that he did, like The West Wing. I think he wrote every single episode of the first 3 or 4 seasons of that, and those seasons were long. That's an insane amount of work to put into something, but the results stand for themselves. He is one of the best in the business. So the more you work, the harder you work. And I like to think that I work really, really hard. That's one of the things that directors I've worked with have said about me, is that they like working with me because we can have a conversation and then 2 weeks later there will be a draft of a script off of that conversation. That I like to work that fast, and I have the luxury of time now that I do it for a living, and I'm not welded to a day job that sacrifices 8 or 9 hours of my day. I can put in the hours and I do the work. It is interesting because the perception I have of it now is very, very different, because I did spend those 20 years aspiring and desiring this as the day job, as a career. And then once you get it, it's very, very strange, because all of a sudden it is the job, and it takes on a different sort of tone, because now you have deadlines, now you have this, that, whatever. Now you do have to take meetings, and you have to be generating a lot of work as well, because you can't just work on one script and then stop for 3 or 4 weeks or 5 or 6 months or this, that, whatever, because you have to then be generating what's the next one going to be. Because if this gets made, you're going to have people saying, what else have you got? You need to have 2 or 3 other things going. So it felt like, I always refer to it as being the career snowballing. It's going downhill, it's getting bigger, it's getting bigger, it's getting bigger, but you have to keep up with it. So whenever I got my first screenwriting option, I immediately started writing something else, because I thought, right, I've got this option now. I'm going to use the clout from this to be able to get my foot in the door a little bit and say, I've got this and I've got this. Well, who else wants in on the work? And that's kind of how I've worked it for the last 3 years. Because, you know, when I first spoke to you, was I had just had my first option, and we were in pre-production on the feature film that became Stalker, which became my first sort of produced feature film that I had written the screenplay for. And from that, everything just started to build and build and build. And I was writing every single day, and I've written about 3 or 4, maybe even 5 feature screenplays since then. And I've started to sort of move towards writing TV pilots and Bibles for TV series, because TV is where a lot of the industry seems to be going. And for the writer, it's a very, very sort of coveted position to be working as, say, a showrunner or working in a writer's room. TV seems to be where it's at. And it also gives you a larger scope to play with. So I've been dealing with, the structure of it's very different. So, you can't just write a pilot series. You have to have laid out what the rest of the series is going to be, including episode breakdowns, all that sort of stuff. Very different from writing a feature script or a short film script, because a feature script is its own contained beast. Once you've written that, you don't have to worry about, well, what else could happen, because you've told the whole story. Whereas with a series, unless it's a limited series, you're looking for a story that you could tell 3 or 4 or 5 seasons in, if you're lucky, if you've got a producer who wants to take it that far. So it changes the structure, and it changes how you look at the work. And I think in terms of where I find myself now, I find myself thinking a lot more about the business side of things, in a way that whenever you dream of being a screenwriter and you're doing it on your own at nighttime and you're just writing scripts for you don't really necessarily have to think about the business side of things. And these days, I'm far more business conscious, and I didn't expect that it was going to go that way. And I don't consider myself some sort of business-minded person, but you do have to start considering certain things. When you write a screenplay, for example, if you've got secondary characters, you have to think about, well, if you get the right producer and the producer has a certain amount of money, you can get a good character actor to come in to play a secondary role. So you kind of have to beef up all the secondary roles so that there's something substantial there. You could then bring in, I don't know, say a Jude Law for 2 days to work as a supporting, So you have to start considering when you're writing that, well, every character has to have something to do, in a way that whenever you're just writing spec scripts for yourself, you're just really thinking about the main characters and the main thrust of the story. So it changes how you work, and it changes how you perceive the work. And I think it is interesting now that I have it as a career and not as a hobby. I kind of find myself, whenever I finish work every day, thinking, what do I do now? What am I going to do that's going to become the hobby? And I've started doing, like, I'm a hobbyist photographer, so I do photography on the side now, and I like to take photographs, and I've always sketched as well. So they've kind of become more the hobby side of things. Even reading has taken a back seat now, because I read so much during the day as part of my work. Because I also work as a screenwriting consultant. So I'm reading maybe 4 or 5 scripts a day, and then writing a 1-pager of notes for the writer. And it sort of changes how, when I go to bed at night, usually I would grab a book and I'll read a couple of chapters, and that's slowed down because I'm so tired of reading by the end of the day. So even that as a hobby has sort of taken a back seat. So it's interesting. But, you mentioned the idea of, like, to get better at running, you run and stuff like that. So I've actually started channeling into a more sort of healthy lifestyle for myself, because I sit down all day. I've got a treadmill now, so I'll do a half hour on the treadmill every morning, and I've got a kettlebell that I'll lift. So that's kind of become the hobby on the side, is sort of a bit more healthy living, which is probably a good thing, because otherwise I'd be sitting down all day, no exercise, probably eating snacks and probably drinking a lot of soda and stuff like that. But all that has been cut out now, and I've sort of, it's sharpened and focused the work in a way, because I'm sort of breaking down my day into
Sure.
these little chunks of time. That's my chunk of time that I'm going to be working out, and this is where I'll work. This is where I'll stop to cook. This is, it's funny. The structure of your life kind of changes in a lot of ways, and I never thought that was going to be the case with this. I thought working as a screenwriter, it would be, when you're naive and you've just finished film school, you naively just say, right, I'm off to Hollywood. But nah, there's 20 years
Yeah.
of working in bookstores and working in hotels and working in bars, and and life also takes over. I got married,
Yes.
I had a child, I got divorced, I had other relationships. Yeah, all this stuff happens, but it's all fuel for the work, because life experience helps as well. The more life experience you have, the better the writing will be. You see it with, I mean, most young screenwriters, when you read their work, it is very focused on where they are at that point in their life. It's very 20 something centric. It's very youth oriented. And I find I gravitate far more to older writers' work, because they've got an entire life experience to draw from. So the work
Yeah.
generally will have more relatable and emotional elements to it. So I suppose it's sort of a long-winded way of saying that I'm quite enjoying getting older as well, because I know the work's getting better at the same time. And I think in terms of, when I look at the films that are getting produced in Britain at the moment, there seem to be waves that happen with the British film industry. We saw it in the 1970s. We were producing quite gritty, realistic, quite interesting work that had a social realist agenda to it. And we've always had that social realist element to it, because we're an independent country, because we are, and I think generally because the majority of the country has always been working class. We have a certain way of telling stories, I think. And yet what I
Sure.
find interesting about that is that, despite the fact predominantly the working class kind of are what makes this country move, or what, it's still being run by an establishment. So there's always been that kind of tugging back and forth between establishment and between the working class person. And we have our filmmakers that explore that. We have Ken Loach, and we have Mike Leigh, and we have those sort of staple filmmakers. I don't see that many writers that are actually tackling those subjects getting a huge amount of attention now in terms of the British film industry. And I think that the British film industry as a whole seems to be working on a set pattern at the moment, and a lot of that comes down to financing. They can only finance so many things. I mean, the BFI is a charity essentially, so there's only so much money to go around, and we are focusing more, it seems, on kind of individual voices, very artistic individual voices. We've got our Lynn Ramseys and people like that, who are producing beautiful, very expressive pieces of work, but they don't necessarily make money at the box office. That's where you look back to the 90s, where a film like The Full Monty would come out, and all of a sudden it was like British cinema is alive and well, and this made a ton of money. That had Fox Searchlight behind it to help market
Sure.
that. We don't have marketing in place for smaller individual films. You look at Ken Loach's last film, The Old Oak. What a wonderful piece of work. But do you see that appearing in any kind of box office records and that? It's hard to actually find cinemas that are showing it at the moment. And I think that, as a writer, I'm always looking to tell sort of personal stories that are going to be relatable to people. I think I often get asked this by screenwriters, and when I teach screenwriting to students, they say, "What is the key element that you look for in a screenplay?" And I always say relatability. I don't care about structure. I don't particularly care about dialogue or action set pieces or any of that stuff. Give me relatability any day of the week, because if I relate to a main character or I relate to a situation, you've got me as an audience member. You can take me anywhere. You can explore any subject. The comparison I like to make is, I say, look at Ken Loach's movie Kess and look at the very first Star Wars movie. Now, what are the relatability factors in both of those movies? They are both about boys who are taking that step into adulthood. Both those movies are exactly the same movie. It's just that because you've got that relatable element in the Ken Loach movie, you've got a movie about a boy stepping into adulthood, but it is exploring the working class and the lower class. It's exploring the fact that there was no future for kids at that point in I think it was in the mid 60s. Kids from that environment didn't really have a future other than going down the pit. And it's interesting because obviously 15 years later, the Thatcher government destroyed all that. So where did that leave kids in terms of futures? It left them with nothing. But Star Wars is exactly the same thing. The Luke Skywalker character at the beginning is left with nothing. So he is able to take that step into whatever
Yeah.
becomes his destiny, which then leads him to a galaxy far, far away. I mean, but both films are doing exactly the same thing. We relate to Luke Skywalker the same way we relate to Billy and Kess. So the relatability element for me is everything. So everything that I write, I am approaching from as human an element as I can. I don't particularly care about it. It's interesting that I have actually made my career on the back of a genre piece because I don't necessarily care too much for horror films, and I don't necessarily care too much for the sort of genre in particular in this country, because in this country we tend to do it's a there's no sort of in between for the horror movie in Britain. You either do something extreme that's quite exploitative, or you do something that people consider highbrow or God forbid. And I've heard this a lot because my horror movie was set in an elevator. Elevated horror. Now, which is a term that I don't necessarily agree with. I think elevated horror is doing the horror industry a disservice in some ways. Horror is
Yeah.
subjective. Horror is what it is, and I don't think having sort of tent poles or categories for these sort of things is anything. But we do tend to categorize in this country anyway, which is why I elevate more to films like, say, Wild Rose, which came out a couple of years ago with Jessie Buckley, which, you know, it has a subtextual agenda about working class families and the struggle it is to chase your dreams and all that sort of stuff. And a lot of our storylines, I think, are aspirational in a way, because in this country we do tend to have to struggle more, and certainly the working class have to struggle more. And so aspiring stories, I think, are really good, but they have to be rooted in a human experience. And that's where I've always gravitated towards. The films that I like tend to have a very strong human element to them. So you've got your Wild Roses, you've got, even the Full Monty, even though it had the powerhouse of sort of American marketing behind it. It is generally about a guy who wants to spend more time with his son. So you've got that relatable human element to it. I'm not seeing enough of those sort of films getting made in this country, and I think it might be because they're just we are it's again, it comes back to that idea that you have to think about the business side of things as well. We are an industry. We do have to at the very least make the money back that we're spending on these films. And the problem is marketing costs so much. So these smaller films, you've got to spend a fortune in marketing to get audiences to go and see them, because they cannot possibly compete with a big blockbuster. I remember last year, I think it was, there was this beautiful film called Ali and Eva came out, which was funded by the BFI. And that movie released the same day as a Spider-Man movie. Now, there's no way on this earth that this beautiful, little, intimate British film about literally that is just about a relationship between a man and a woman can compete with a Marvel juggernaut. It's just insane. So, I mean, it's hard to have to sort of aspire to write something, particularly in this country, and that's interesting because the screenwriting I've done since, I have sort of aimed it more towards, I wrote a crime thriller that has gangsters in it, and that's clearly something that you could set it in this country, but I wrote it with an eye towards it being American based. So that's something that we could take and we could make in America with American actors. And yet, I don't like the fact that I have to sort of work in that way. I'd like to be able to write gangster movies and have them get produced here, but we have a very sort of we have a set way of doing gangster movies in this country as well, or certainly seems to be in the last 20 years, where it's that kind of Ray Winstone slapping swear word every 2 second kind of thing, and they're all Cockney. It's all London East End. Our gangster movies, and we've got a whole country we could be playing about with here. So I don't know why we don't embrace that, and that's one of the things that Adam Nelson, who directed The Mire, that I wrote the screenplay for, that's something that he and I talked about, was the idea of we could have set The Mire anywhere, but he wanted it to be set in Portsmouth, which is a city that he has been filming in for years now, and he's made films there probably around 10 years now, and he wants to be able to make a film that could play in the same way as a Ray Winstone gangster movie, but not have to be constrained to have it being set in London. We seem to have a narrow-minded idea of how things need to be set. If your film is set in Scotland, you've got to either set it in Glasgow or Edinburgh. I mean, I live in Aberdeen. Aberdeen's a great city and has a lot of cinematic potential. I mean, interestingly,
Sure.
John Baird, who is a filmmaker who comes actually from my hometown, same as me, from Peterhead, he directed Tetris last year, and he shot a pile of that in Aberdeen because the architecture matches 1980s Russia. So, which I thought was really interesting. So I was watching the movie and I'm going like, I know those flats, I know that building, I know where that is. And yet in this country, you know, if I was to write a romantic comedy and set it in Aberdeen, the first thing a producer would say to me is, well, can you set it in Edinburgh or can you set it in Glasgow? So yeah, we
Yeah.
need to start embracing here. I mean, in Scotland, you either set a film in Glasgow or it's in the Highlands with people in kilts running about with swords. You know,
Yeah.
I understand why we can't, you know, because there's a relatability element there as well. If you set a film in Glasgow, it's either about a slick gangster type or it's about a really rough working class family who are struggling, and there's drugs and
Yeah.
there's debt collectors and it's miserable. Why can't we make a romantic comedy? Why can't we have a Richard Curtis movie that is set in Glasgow? I don't understand.
Every,
That's, I mean, and that, I think, interestingly, that's where television really is starting to come into its own, because television offers a much wider scope in terms of the stories you can tell and where you set it and all that sort of stuff. You look at some of the great dramas that have come out, like look at Happy Valley. I mean, if Happy Valley had been written as a feature film, it would have had to have been set in London or somewhere like that. But where they set it, it's perfectly set. Or that TV show Stephen Merchant made, The Outlaws, which I think was filmed in Bristol and was set in Bristol. Whereas, you know, if that had been a feature film, they'd have set it in London. I don't know where the sort of breakaway point has to be where they when it comes to film. I don't know whether they think it's just not cinematic enough, but I don't know. In this country, we've never particularly been as interested in visual style as we have been in the writing,
yeah.
which I suppose is good for me. In this country, we are very script based, and I think that's why when someone like Danny Boyle came along in the '90s with this frantic kinetic energy, we didn't quite know what to do with him until Trainspotting hit. And then all of a sudden, everybody
Yeah.
wanted to do that Danny Boyle style, and he is just coming from he's coming from the Brian De Palma school of cinema, you know, where it was incredibly visual and very expressive and throwing colors the way Scorsese does. You just throw colors at the screen if you want to, and fade outs can be done in red instead of white or black, and all these sort of. And we've never been good, I think, at balancing out the two, where the writing and the visual style can work together. That's why I find it very valuable for me that I've been very lucky the last couple of years that I've been working with directors from the start. So when I'm writing, if I write a first draft of something, I give it to, say, Steve Johnson, who directed Stalker, and he and I have been working and developing projects together ever since we met on that film. And I think it's really interesting to get that visual perspective from someone, because I'm not a writer who ever wants to be a director or ever wants to be a producer. I just want to be a screenwriter, which I think probably puts me in a good position in this country, because a lot of people, when they go to film school, for example, they want to be a writer director or they want to be a director. Nobody wants to be a producer. No, and I think we see that at the moment. There's not that many producers in this country outside of the ones that are working on a larger scale for independent films. Independent
Mhm.
cinema, I think, is in a real nadir at the moment in a way that we haven't seen since probably the 80s. And it's a real shame, because I work within sort of primarily the independent sector. And I know there are some incredibly talented people out there and incredibly good stories that are waiting to be told. We don't have producers who are able to go out there and look at getting financiers involved and getting production companies involved. It seems to be a real problem at the moment. And also, I think the perception of what a producer does is not being sort of it's not being looked at the way a lot of people, I think, naively assume that that if you have a script and you've got a director, the producer pays for everything. And it's like, I'm like, that's not what a producer does. A producer has to facilitate the entire production and has to go out there and find the money.
Yeah.
It's not like a producer comes along with a very large wallet and says, "I've got £1 million, I'll pay for this." That's not what it does. You know. And even when I was younger, when I was 15, 16 years old, that's what I assumed a producer did. A producer paid for the film and then would reap it back whenever the film was a success. And then when you get a bit older and realize that that makes no business sense whatsoever, you're like, all right, that makes incredibly. It's an incredibly overlooked part of the filmmaking process, I think, in this country, and even in other countries, I think it's overlooked that producers are really important, and getting a good producer and a producer who's not just business focused but creative minded is really important as well. Working with a producer who wants the script to be as good as it can be and wants the visual style to be as good as it can be, they're like gold dust in this country. And I think from a writing perspective, I am lucky that I get to sort of send my script to certain people at this point, and I have a little into the industry, but it never guarantees in any way, shape, or form that you're going to get greenlit. I'm stuck in a sort of development pattern at the moment. I've had two feature films, and this is rare. I've had two feature films essentially shot back to back. One of them's come out, Stalker, which, you know, I go into HMV and there it is, it's sitting on the shelf. It's in the horror section between The Stand and Salem's Lot, which I think is really funny. Wow. I'm sort of sandwiched between Stephen King, which is not a bad place to be, I suppose, but it is weird. I walk in there and say, 3 years ago that was just in my head, and now it's a DVD on a shelf. Which is an interesting experience. But that was shot back to back with The Mire, which, you know, we started work on that 3 years ago, and we're only now, I mean, it's finished and it's been sitting finished for about a year. We've had a premiere down in Portsmouth, which was great, but now we're going out to distributors and we're trying to get this thing out there for people to see. And it's incredibly difficult because you consider that this is a film that was shot for a very low budget. It looks much better than the amount it was shot for. You wouldn't assume when you know what the budget is that it was shot for that, but it hasn't got stars. It doesn't have even like a TV actor in it that pops in for a cameo or anything like that. So the chances of that getting it, I mean, marketing will all be taken care on our side of things. It's all going to be social media charge. That's, you know, you have to be realistic about this that's where the business side of things comes into it. But since the back-to-back experience of those two films, it's all been development for me, with the exception of the short film that's just about to come out. And it's, you know, like I say, I've written 3 or 4 screenplays that I've been commissioned to write. And then my work is done, essentially, until they can get financing in place and development money in place. Then I'll come back on board and I'll start doing rewrites on it. But until then, I've got all this work sort of sitting. And that's the life of a screenwriter anyway. 90% of any screenwriter's work over the course of their life will never get produced, and 10% of it will. You know, you look at a screenwriter like Bruce Robinson, who wrote Withnail and I and Jennifer 8, and he has been writing for like 40, 50 years at this point. He's only got about 4 films that have been produced, and he's got about 40 or 50 screenplays that are sitting, all of which I'm sure are pretty damn good, because he's an extremely good writer. Yeah. And yet can't get them made because the production system in this country is not built in a way that can really sustain a sort of like mass market in that way. We can't compete with the Americans in terms of marketing and in terms of financing. We just can't. And even the Americans, I think, are finding it hard at this point. You're seeing a lot more larger films whenever you watch them in the cinema or at home. There's about 17 production companies come up before you get to the start of the movie. And there's more and more that they're having to claw more and more production from several different sources at this point. And I think that a lot of that has to do with the ripple effect of the pandemic. You look at what's in the cinema now, it's generally horror, action, or science fiction. It's strictly genre because that's the only thing people are going to see. People, I think, are still a bit wary about going to the cinema at this point. And also financially, movies cost a lot of money to go and see, you know? I mean, you go on a Friday night, it's $20 a pop. That movie better be good for that amount of money. So I think we've got as a writer, I feel like I've got a huge responsibility to make sure I'm telling a story that is going to be worth these people's time and money. You look at the age of the blockbuster seems to be coming a bit to an end as well. I've been saying this to people for a while now. I think that we're going to have a little renaissance of independent filmmaking, particularly in America. Because you look at, you know, the Marvel movies aren't making their money back anymore. And, you know, we're living in a world where an Indiana Jones movie can't make its money back. Now, admittedly, that costs $300 million to make. And I don't know how that costs that much money to make. That's insane. And then if you factor in it costs 300 million to make, then you have to factor in that you got to double that for the marketing. That movie's got to nearly make $1 billion just to break even, and that's the way blockbusters seem to be going at this point. That's insane. That is not sustainable, and the industry's going to have to go back to telling these smaller stories. You remember in the 90s, and it was great. I was a teenager in the 90s, and I was just starting to want to get into films. And we had every week American indie cinema was bringing out 2 or 3 fantastic pieces of work, and it's going to go back to that because the way it is working at the moment is just not sustainable. They're not going to make enough money, and also you look at things like the Marvel, and I'm not going to sit and diss Marvel. They've done a couple of really good movies, and it's a model that for 10 years worked really well, but the costs keep going up. And you look at the fact that they start making movies based off the back of a release date. I remember when the first Jurassic World movie came out, the one of the Chris Pine ones, and I can't stand those movies. But as an example, that first Jurassic World movie came out, and it made a fortune in its opening weekend. And the next week, they announced a release date for the sequel. They didn't have a script yet, didn't have a cast, didn't have a director, but they had a release date. Now you've got to sprint towards that release date, which means, of course, when that movie came out, the script's crap, the acting's rubbish, even the effects actually don't look as good as when you look at the first Jurassic Park. The effects in that still hold up in a way that new effects just don't, because they're rushing. Look at the original sequels to Raiders of the Lost Ark, like Temple of Doom and Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade. They were made like 3 or 4 or 5 years apart from each other because they weren't rushing. They weren't like Raiders of the Lost Ark came out and it's a big hit. It's not like the mentality they have today. They're like, it's a big hit, sequel immediately. No. They took their time, and therefore the scripts are better, and therefore the story's good, and they don't have to rush. And that's something that we're not doing now. I feel personally very, very lucky because unlike a lot of people that are trying to work and be screenwriters in this industry, I technically have a day job off the back of it, which is working as a script consultant. I'm a reader for a couple of screenwriting festivals, and I've done bits and bobs for a few different colleges and universities where I'll come in and I'll read a script and I'll do the page of notes, and I do these Zoom one-on-one consultations all the time, and it facilitates in a certain way the sort of the income I get from that allows me to be able to write on my own time and on my own schedule, which I know a lot of people don't have. And I'd say, to anybody that's trying to get into the industry as just a writer, it's not a bad thing to look at. And there's an awful lot of screenwriting competitions out there, and they need readers. Look at different script competitions and different screenwriting festivals and see if any of them are looking for readers, because it's a very interesting and nice way to sort of supplement a little bit of money coming in that then affords you the time to be able to write as well as you can and to write as much as you can as well. And I think that the more you write, like we were talking about, the more you write, the better the writing is going to get anyway. And streaming services, as much as they have sort of placed the industry in a sort of unsure footing, they are also a very sort of beneficial means by which all of a sudden they're crying out for more programming. They're crying, and they're all going into original programming at this point. Amazon has its own TV series. Amazon has its own movies. Netflix, same thing. All Apple TV is producing some wonderful stuff now and working with wonderful people. But you do notice that most of the Apple original stuff is only coming from established filmmakers because again, it's a business. They have to make money. People are talking about how Killers of the Flower Moon only made a certain amount of money, so it's a flop. And you think to yourself, well, no, Apple have the rights to that movie forever, and they're going to make the money on that movie off the back of it being on their streaming service, never mind what it did in its theatrical run. And it's weird because it is a catch-22, because I think as people who love films and who growing up we went to the pictures, it was a different experience. And we do sound like old men, I know that, but it was a different experience going to the pictures when we were little, because multiplexes weren't a thing. I remember my hometown, which I ended up being the projectionist working in that cinema. It was a one-screen cinema. It was a beautiful Art Deco cinema, had the balcony, had the red curtains would open. It felt more like an experience, and it felt more like almost akin to going to the theater to see a play in a lot of ways. And we don't have that anymore because multiplexes, it feels too business for me in a lot of ways. You go in, you're not taking in your surroundings, you've chosen your seat, you sit down, you watch the movie, that's it. Whereas when you were a kid going to the pictures, you had to wait in line outside. You weren't even sure if you were going to get in to see the movie if the screen
Yeah,
was full.
yeah, absolutely.
And that experience alone made it feel like something special. Then you'd go in, the auditorium was beautiful, and the red curtains were closed, and then they would open and the lights would dim. We don't get any of that experience anymore. And that's the stuff that I think made people and compelled people to go to the cinema in the first place. And we see that the cinema now, you go to the cinema on, say, a Wednesday night, it's never a full screen. Whereas when I was a kid, if you went to the cinema on a Wednesday night, it would be full because the community was going to the cinema, and also there weren't as many films being produced. There was maybe 4 or 5 films coming out a week. Now there's 30 or 40 coming out. It's just ridiculous, and you know, you cannot possibly imagine that there is a packed screen for all those films. It is weird because, you know, we're living in the age where this is all so accessible, and yet we've lost the experience of it. We don't go to the cinema just to see a movie. We go to the cinema to be in a collective with a group of people who have all gone there. You know, we don't know any of the people in an auditorium when we're sitting there to watch a movie, but we have all had that one similar thought, which is, I'm going to see this movie tonight. So when you're sitting in that audience, doesn't matter if you're sitting next to a stranger, the thing you have in common with that person is you both chose to go and see that movie at this exact point. And we don't have that anymore, I don't think. And I think that that is a real loss. And the experience of laughing at jokes and crying at something emotional and being in awe. Special effects, I think, as well, have really, because special effects are so easy to produce now. I mean, I say that as someone who's not in the effects industry. I'm not dissing effects people. I'm sure it's very hard to do this, but, you know, every movie that comes out as a blockbuster now has a huge number of special effects now. They are easier to produce than they were 20 years ago. Let's just say that, which is not to say that the job of the effects people is easy, but we've lost awe in cinema as well, which is why when a film like Oppenheimer comes along using practical effects and is made by a filmmaker who understands what cinema can be, we have the awe back. We are blown away by what we're seeing, and what we're seeing is actually, you know, it is just a very large explosion that they managed to film in a particular way. But that's cinema. That to me, you have been stirred up for an hour and a half watching these people build this thing, then it's destroyed, and the sheer awe that you get in the cinema, we don't get that anymore. We don't have cinema has not, in the last 20 years, as far as I'm concerned, found a way to replicate the experience of watching Elliot going across the moon in silhouette with E.T. Like, we don't have imagery like that really anymore. We don't have filmmakers who fundamentally understand that cinema is about projecting your dreams and showing you things that you cannot see in any other way. And, you know, as much as I like the smaller movies and the independent movies, I'm greedy. I want to think that for my $20 I can have it all. I want a film that's going to give me everything that I want from cinema, that's going to be visually arresting and hypnotic, but is also going to be telling me a story about characters I care about, or characters that I hate, and that will have passion in it. And that's why, as a writer, it feels like my responsibility to try and deliver those sort of stories. Whether they get made is almost a moot point, because in this country, 90% of what I'm going to write for the rest of my life is never going to get produced. But it's, you know, it's those little percentages that will get produced. I have to try and work my hardest to make sure that I am giving the audience the experience that they deserve for their $20 on a Friday night, you know? Well, thank you for bringing that up. Yes, I mean, I started it as a little freelance thing. As soon as I left my day job, I realized, right, I need to actually be getting some money in, because I'd had my script payout for my option, that sort of stuff. So I was like, right, this sustains me enough to be able to leave my day job, but I'm going to need to have money coming in. So I started doing script consultation work, and I thought, well, I can do this freelance as well as working for these script competitions. So I just set up this little thing called the Script Courier, which a very clever play on words, I know, ha ha ha. But it essentially was a means, as far as I was concerned. I kept thinking about me when I was 15 or 16 years old, and I wanted to be a screenwriter, and I was writing for the first time. And I kept thinking how much I would have killed to be able to actually speak to somebody, and not somebody famous, not somebody that has a name or anything, somebody who was a working screenwriter, who was working in the industry. But I also didn't want, I also remembered being poor and not having much money. And I didn't
Sure.
want to charge an arm and a leg for this service. And I know I've had screenwriters say to me, you do realize you're charging way too little for what you're offering here. And I'm like, yeah, but that's the point. I'm working on my own schedule. I'm only taking on as much as I know I can handle. I don't want to take a huge chunk of money off of people who 5 years ago I was in exam. And I think it's, you want to give back a little bit. And like I say, I'm not Aaron Sorkin. And I've had the people that go and slide into my DMs and they say, well, why should I pay you to give me anything like that? I'm like, well, I'm not pointing a gun at you and telling you that you must. You can take it or leave it. You can look at my IMDb page. You can go to my LinkedIn page. There's my credentials. I've got an honors degree. I've got films produced, and I work in the industry. I do this for a living now. Where what are your credentials? And you get those people, but 99% of the people that I've done this consultation work for, they're incredibly nice people and incredibly creative and really enthusiastic about getting their script as good as it can be. And having the knowledge that I've accrued over just the last 5 years, working with producers, working with directors, and seeing that you have to factor in business into the writing as well, and how you can be creative but also fiscally responsible at the same time. I think that that's valuable, and I also get something out of it. I've made some wonderful sort of colleagues and friends off of doing this. I get to know what another writer's process is. I get to see what their thought process is on how they came to construct this script, and I get to read some really great movies that if we're realistic, whenever as a script reader, I read thousands of scripts over the course of the last few years. I've read thousands of scripts. 99% of those are never going to see the light of day. So I'm one of the privileged few that gets to watch that movie as I'm reading that script. And that's a great experience for me. But I mean, if any screenwriter out there is wanting to have that kind of discussion, my rates and services, you look on my Twitter page, and then just give me a DM. The DMs stay open. That's generally how I get my clients, is mostly from Twitter and from my socials. Notes are valuable. I can't tell you how many screenwriters I know who refuse to get notes. They're like, no, nobody will understand my vision. I'm like, you don't. I mean, it baffles me sometimes. I'm like, you do the same thing I do. You realize that whenever we're writing, we are so in it when we're writing it. We just don't see the inconsistencies. We don't see the plot holes, or that a character does something twice, or does something stupid, or that a line of dialogue doesn't make sense. We just don't see it. Outsider, a new fresh pair of eyes on it. And I'm lucky. I've got people that are in the industry. I've got directors that I can show it to, and they see immediately through it. Like Steve Johnson, I always joke, who I've been working with now for the last 3 years. I always joke that he's the person that I take any script I write to first, because he essentially, I'll give him a script and he will take a hammer and just smash it into pieces and then push it back towards me and say, put it back together in a different way, and we'll have a conversation about that. But he's looking at it from a filmmaker perspective that I don't have. I look at things as a writer. If I can make it work on the page, that's my job. It's the director's job and the producer's job to try and facilitate that, to get it up on the screen. But there is a collaboration there where, you can have it both ways. You can write a screenplay that can suggest what visually this film will be, but not be so specific that any director reading it will be like, how dare they tell me how to shoot this movie? It's finding that balance. And that's the thing that I like to do in my consultations most of the time, and my script notes, is find that balance. Because like you say, filmmaking is a collaborative process. Once you've finished what you think might be your final draft, there's going to be 10 other drafts down the line on that. It's just that simple. It's going to reshape and remold depending on, because you have to facilitate the filmmaker's vision as well. If you're not directing it yourself, the director is going to have a specific way that they see your story, and it's not always going to gel with the way you see it. I am at the Chris Watt, all lowercase, all one word. It makes me sound egotistical, but I tried just Chris Watt. It was taken. I tried a whole bunch of variations. They were all taken. The Chris Watt was the only one that was not taken. So that's my Twitter handle, unfortunately. But it does make it does have a slight ego twist to it. But whatever, I couldn't help it.